In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, where the sun bakes the earth into a cracked canvas of rust and gold, some stories aren't written in ink, they're etched in gunpowder grit and blood. This isn't a tale of legendary lawmen or notorious outlaws you've heard 100 times. This is the story of a forgotten woman, an orphan seamstress named Elara Vance, whose world was no bigger than the eye of her needle. But when a dying Apache warrior collapsed on her doorstep, that needle became a surgeon's tool, and her quiet life was plunged into a storm of prejudice, danger, and a love so forbidden it threatened to burn the entire frontier to the ground. The town of Redemption Gulch was a place of last chances, which was to say it was a place with very few chances left at all. It clung to the scorched earth of the Arizona Territory like a stubborn burr, a single dusty street flanked by sun-bleached wooden buildings. For Elara Vance, it was the only home she had ever known. Her world was the small second-story room above Henderson's Mercantile, a space that smelled perpetually of chalk thread and the lye soap she used to wash her fabrics. From her window, she saw the world in squares of muted color: the unyielding blue of the sky, the ochre of the street, the faded calico of a homesteader's wife hurrying past. Elara was the town's seamstress, an orphan raised by the church until she was old enough to earn her keep with a needle and thread. Her parents, she'd been told, were taken by the fever that swept through the mining camps a decade prior. She was a ghost in her own life, quiet and meticulous, her presence as soft and unobtrusive as the stitches she sewed. The townsfolk treated her with a kind of polite indifference. She was useful for mending shirts and hemming dresses, but she was not one of them. She didn't gossip at the well, she didn't drink sarsaparilla at the saloon, and she never attended the Sunday socials. Her loneliness was a cloak she wore so constantly, she no longer felt its weight. Her only consistent tormentor was Sheriff Silas Croft, a man whose ambition had long outgrown the smallness of redemption. Gulch Croft saw Elara as another piece of property to be eventually acquired. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way, with a silver star pinned to a chest puffed with unearned importance. A fine afternoon, Miss Vance, he'd say, leaning against the Mercantile's support beam, his eyes roaming over her as she collected supplies. "A woman like you shouldn't be cooped up in that room all day. It's not natural." Elara would just nod her gaze, fixed on the bolt of cotton in her hands. "I have work, Sheriff. Work can wait." He'd press his voice, lowering. "A pretty thing like you needs a man to look after her. A man with prospects." She knew his prospects involved leveraging his position to seize control of the nearby Black Creek water rights, and his protection was a thinly veiled threat. He made her skin crawl the way a spider might. She always managed to slip away her heart, a frantic drum against her ribs, leaving him smiling a predator's smile in the dust. On a Tuesday in late August, the sky turned the color of a deep bruise. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on Elara's arms stand on end. Dust devils danced down the street, and the usual drone of the town fell into an expectant hush. A storm was coming, not the gentle summer rain that offered brief respite, but a violent, lashing monsoon that would turn the baked ground to a torrent of mud. Elara rushed to pull her small shutters closed, the wind already whipping strands of her auburn hair across her face. The first drops of rain fell like pebbles, quickly escalating into a deafening roar on her tin roof. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in stark skeletal flashes. It was in one of these flashes that she saw it. A figure slumped against the water trough across the street. It was a man half collapsed, his form barely distinguishable in the deluge. Another lightning strike revealed more dark, wet hair, plastered to his face, buckskin clothing, and the unmistakable profile of an Apache. Panic seized her. The Apache were ghosts of the surrounding Chiricahua Mountains, spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. There had been raids, skirmishes with cavalry patrols from Fort Grant. To the people of Redemption, Gulch an Apache was not a man. He was a threat, a savage, the embodiment of the wilderness they so desperately sought to tame. Her first instinct was to bolt the door and pretend she'd seen nothing. Let the storm take him. Let the morning find him gone. It was the safe thing to do, the same thing to do. Sheriff Croft would likely give a bounty to whoever found the body. But then another flash of lightning. The man's head was lifted. His face turned toward her window for a fleeting second. Elara saw not a monster, but a mask of agony. His side was dark with a spreading stain, his body trembling with shock and blood loss. He was dying. Her parents had died of a fever, their bodies shaking with chills she could do nothing to stop. She had been a helpless child then, watching life fade away. Now seeing this man, this stranger, this supposed enemy, shivering in the mud, she saw only that same helplessness. The seamstress, the quiet observer, the woman who had spent her life avoiding notice, did the most dangerous thing she could possibly do. Cursing her own compassion as madness, she unbolted her door and ran out into the roaring storm. The mud sucked at her boots as she half-dragged, half-carried the surprisingly heavy man across the street and into the narrow stairwell leading to her room. He was barely conscious, muttering words in a language she didn't understand, his body a dead weight against hers. She strained her muscles, screaming, fueled by a terrifying, inexplicable surge of adrenaline. Finally, she got him through her door and barred it shut, the sound of the bolt clicking into place, feeling like a death sentence. He collapsed onto the rag rug in the center of her room. The storm raged outside, but inside a new and far more dangerous storm had just begun. The Apache warrior lay bleeding on her floor, and Elara Vance, the Orphan Seamstress, was no longer invisible. She was a traitor. The silence in the room was a living thing, broken only by the warrior's ragged breaths and the drumming of rain on the roof. Elara stood frozen for a long moment, her hand pressed to her mouth, the full, terrifying weight of her actions crashing down on her. Beneath the flickering lamplight, the man was a stark figure of alien wilderness in her meticulously ordered world. His face, even slack with pain, was proud and sharp-boned. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a nose like the beak of a hawk. His skin was the color of rich earth, and his long black hair was matted with mud and blood. A deep gash, crusted and angry, ran along his ribs on the left side. It wasn't a knife wound. It was ragged torn. A bullet. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her hands, the hands that knew the delicate art of mending torn lace and piecing together quilts, moved with a purpose of their own. She fetched her sewing basket, not for thread, but for her sharpest scissors. She took a deep breath and began to cut away the wet, clinging buckskin shirt. The wound was worse than she'd imagined. The bullet had torn through flesh and muscle, and the area around it was inflamed and swollen. He needed a doctor, but Dr. Miller was a gossip whose loyalty lay firmly with Sheriff Croft. Taking this man to him would be the same as taking him to the gallows. "Stay still," she whispered, though she doubted he could understand. As her fingers brushed against his skin, his eyes snapped open. They were not dull with pain as she expected, but fiercely, intensely black and alert. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and his hand, through trembling, shot out and clamped around her wrist. His grip was like iron. Elara froze, the scissors held inches from his body. She met his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw no savagery in his eyes, but a cornered animal's desperate will to survive. She saw suspicion, pain, and a profound, weary distrust. He was judging her, trying to understand why a white woman would bring an enemy into her home. Slowly, deliberately, she relaxed her body. She did not pull away. She simply held his gaze and spoke in a low, calm voice, the way one might soothe a spooked horse. "I am not going to hurt you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You are hurt. I want to help." He didn't release her, but the pressure of his grip lessened fractionally. He watched her. His eyes narrowed, searching her face for any sign of deception. She held up her other hand, showing him the clean bandages she'd laid out, the bowl of hot water, the small bottle of carbolic acid she used for sterilizing her needles. "Please," she said again, "let me help." For a long minute that stretched into an eternity, they remained locked in that silent standoff. Then, with a slow, deliberate exhale, he released her wrist. His eyes never left hers as he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The trust fragile as a spider's thread had been offered. For the next 2 hours, Elara worked with a concentration she normally reserved for the most intricate lacework. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her stomach churning at the sight. The bullet was still in there, lodged deep. She knew she didn't have the skill to remove it. All she could do was fight the infection and the fever she knew was coming. She boiled her strongest needles and thickest thread. When she brought them over, he watched her, his expression unreadable. She gestured to the wound, then to the needle. This would be the worst part. He spoke for the first time, his voice a low, rough rasp. "It will hurt." His English was clear-accented but understandable. Elara was startled, but tried not to show it. She simply nodded. "Yes, it will." He grunted, then tore a piece of leather from his belt and clenched it between his teeth. He laid his head back and stared at the ceiling, his jaw tight. It was the only permission she would get. Stitching the torn flesh was the hardest thing she had ever done. It felt like a violation, pushing a needle into another human being. But she focused on the task, her movements as precise and steady, as if she were mending a fine silk gown. He never made a sound, though she could see the cords in his neck stand out and feel the shudders that ran through his body. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly. He was slick with sweat, his breathing shallow. The fever was already setting in. She managed to get him to drink some water, mixed with willow bark tea, an old remedy for pain and fever. Then, with great effort, she helped him onto her own narrow bed, covering him with a quilt. She spent the night in her rocking chair, the lamp turned low, watching him. He tossed and turned, lost in a fevered delirium, crying out words in his own tongue, harsh, guttural commands, and soft, mournful whispers. Elara kept a cool cloth on his forehead, changed his bandages when they bled through, and forced sips of water between his lips. Sometime before dawn, the fever broke. His breathing evened out, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. Elara sagged in her chair, exhaustion washing over her in a wave. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a clean, rain-washed world. But her own storm was just gathering strength. She had an Apache warrior in her bed, in a town where his people were hated and feared she was harboring the enemy. Every knock on the door, every footstep on the stairs would now be a threat. Her small, quiet room had become the most dangerous place in the Arizona territory. She looked at the sleeping man, at the proud, stoic lines of his face, softened in slumber, and felt a terrifying and unfamiliar emotion, a fierce, defiant sense of possession. He was her secret, and she would protect him. The days that followed were a tightrope walk of fear and intimacy. Elara's small room became a self-contained universe, a sanctuary sealed off from the hostile world below. During the day, the warrior who told her his name was Kyle remained utterly silent. He would lie on her bed still and watchful, his black eyes following her every move as she worked on a wedding dress for the banker's daughter. The rhythmic snick of her scissors and the soft pull of thread through fabric were the only sounds. His silence was not empty, it was observant. He watched how she moved, how she made her meager meals, how she carefully tended the small pot of geraniums on her windowsill. And Elara, in turn, learned the landscape of his stillness. She saw the discipline in it, the patience of a hunter. She noticed the way his hands, though weakened, were never truly at rest. His fingers often tracing patterns on the quilt that she imagined were maps of canyons and mountains. At night, when the town settled into slumber, and the only light came from her single lamp, he would talk. His voice, stronger each day, was a low rumble that filled the quiet space. He told her his name, Kyle, meant "he who fights fiercely," in the language of his people, the Chiricahua Apache. He told her of the stronghold in the mountains, a place of stone and pine where his people lived. He spoke not of battles and raids, but of the smell of ponderosa after a rain, of the taste of roasted agave, of the stories the elders told around the fire. Elara, who had no family stories of her own, listened with a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. In return, she told him about her life, a simple plain story of needles and thread. She spoke of her parents, whom she barely remembered, and the loneliness that had been her constant companion. "You are not lonely," Kyle said one night, his gaze intense. "You are Tsana alone. It is different. Loneliness is a sickness of the spirit. To be alone is to be whole by yourself." His words struck her. In her room, with this forbidden guest, she felt more whole than she ever had in the bustling street below. A fragile bond was weaving itself between them, stitch by delicate stitch. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight tightening of his jaw that meant pain, the flicker in his eyes that meant he was amused by something. She found herself smiling more, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest when he would give a soft grunt of approval at the taste of her rabbit stew. But the world outside her window refused to be ignored. Sheriff Croft's attention grew more persistent. He had noticed her absence. She no longer took her daily walk to the well, instead paying a boy a penny to bring her water, claiming she was too busy with the wedding dress. One afternoon, his heavy boots stomped up her stairs. Elara's heart leapt into her throat. She gestured frantically at Kyle, who, with a fluid grace that belied his injury, slid from the bed and pressed himself flat against the wall behind the door, a small skinning knife she hadn't known he possessed suddenly in his hand. Knock, knock, knock. Miss Vance Croft's voice was smooth, but laced with an impatience that set her teeth on edge. "One moment, Sheriff," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and opened the door just wide enough to block the view of the room. Croft's eyes swept over her. "Working hard, I see. You look pale. Not coming down with something, are you?" "Just tired, Sheriff. This dress requires a great deal of focus." He tried to peer past her into the room. "Smells different here, like herbs." He sniffed the air, and something else. It was the poultice of comfrey and yarrow she'd been using on Kyle's wound. "Just some herbal tea for my nerves, Sheriff. The banker's wife is very particular." His gaze lingered on her face, probing and suspicious. "I heard you talking down at the saloon. The Brody brothers are back from their prospecting trip up near the Gila River. They came back in a hurry. Said they ran into a spot of trouble. An Apache scout. Shot him, but he got away in that flash storm we had." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the doorknob so tightly her knuckles turned white. The Brody brothers, Jebediah and Amos, were notoriously cruel men, known for their greed and casual brutality. They say they tracked him as far as the Black Creek before the rain washed out the tracks. Croft continued, his eyes narrowed to slits. Funny thing that's less than a mile from town. He was watching her, she realized, watching for a reaction. He was fishing. He didn't know anything for sure, but his predator's instinct had picked up a scent. She forced a look of mild disinterest onto her face. "That's terrible. I hope they are all right." Croft's lips twisted into a smirk. "Oh, they're fine. But they're mighty angry about losing that Apache. They seem to think he was from Koshisa's own band. Might have been carrying something valuable." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's a reward for any information, Miss Vance. A substantial one, enough to set a woman up quite nicely." The threat was clear. He was offering her a choice, be his informant or be his suspect. "I haven't seen a soul, Sheriff," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "Now, if you'll excuse me, this place won't sow itself." She closed the door in his face, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She leaned against it, her eyes shut, listening as his boots descended the stairs. When he was gone, she turned to see Kyle emerge from the shadows, his face a grim, stony mask. The knife was still in his hand. "They are the ones," he said. It was not a question. Elara nodded her throat, too tight to speak. "I must leave," he said, moving to gather the few things he had, his belt, his knife. He winced as the movement pulled at his stitches. "You can't!" she protested, rushing to his side. "You're not healed. That wound will open up, and you'll bleed to death before you reach the foothills. To stay is to bring death to your door." He countered, his voice harsh. "That man, the one with the star, he knows. He does not know what, but he smells a secret." "We'll be more careful," she insisted, a desperation in her voice that surprised her. The thought of him leaving of the room, returning to its empty silence, was suddenly unbearable. He stopped and looked at her, his black eyes searching hers. The air between them crackled with unspoken emotions. At that moment she wasn't a white woman, and he wasn't an Apache warrior. They were just a man and a woman, in a small room, bound by a dangerous secret, and a connection that ran deeper than words. "Kyle," she whispered, her hand instinctively going to his arm. "Don't go." His gaze dropped to her hand on his arm, then lifted back to her face. The hardness in his expression softened, replaced by something complex and deeply vulnerable. He knew she was right, but he also knew that with every passing hour, the fragile piece of their sanctuary was cracking, ready to shatter. The whispers in the town were growing louder, and Sheriff Croft's threats were drawing a noose around them both. The next 2 days were fraught with a tension so thick, Elara felt she could barely breathe. Every creak of the floorboards from the mercantile below sent a jolt of panic through her. She kept the shutters closed, claiming the bright sun was fading the delicate silk of the wedding dress. The room became a dim, claustrophobic cave, a world of shadows and hushed whispers. Kyle was growing stronger. The fever was long gone, and the color had returned to his face. He moved around the small room with a restless, prowling energy, his body yearning for the open spaces he called home. He would stand for long periods at the sliver of open shutter, gazing out at the distant hazy peaks of the Chiricahua Mountains. "My people will be searching," he said one evening, his back to her. "They will think the Pindalikoyi, the White Eyes, have taken me, or that I am dead." "Will they come here?" Elara asked, her voice small. They do not come to towns unless there is war, but they will watch. They are always watching. His words offered no comfort. Sheriff Croft had also been watching. He made a point of stationing himself across the street, whittling a piece of wood, his eyes fixed on her window for hours at a time. It was a war of nerves, and Elara knew she was losing. Her supply of dried meat and beans was dwindling, and she couldn't risk another trip to the mercantile. The breaking point came on the third day. It began with a heavy, insistent pounding on her door that was too loud, too aggressive to be anyone but the sheriff. Elara Vance. "Open this door. I have a warrant to search these premises." Elara and Cale exchanged a panicked look. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The window Kyle hissed, grabbing his knife. Elara flew to the back window. It overlooked a narrow, filth-strewn alleyway. It was a 12-foot drop to the ground, too high to jump without injury, especially for him. "There's no time," she cried, as the door shuddered under a heavy blow. Croft was trying to break it down. Kyle's eyes scanned the room, landing on the heavy, half-finished wedding dress, hanging on its dummy form. In a flash of desperate inspiration, he tore at the bolts of silk and satin still on her table. "Your rope," he commanded, pointing to the thick cord she used to tie her bales of fabric. As she fumbled to get it, he ripped the expensive fabrics into long, wide strips. With quick, deft movements, his fingers tying knots she'd never seen before, he began braiding the strips together, integrating her rope into the weave. The door splintered a crack, appearing near the lock. "Hurry," she urged. He worked with blinding speed, his face a mask of concentration. When the makeshift rope was nearly 10 feet long, he tied one end securely around the leg of her heavy iron bed frame. Crack. The door flew open, slamming against the wall. Sheriff Croft stood in the doorway, his pistol drawn. Behind him were the leering, triumphant faces of Jebediah and Amos Brody. For a moment, everyone froze. Croft's eyes widened in shock, and then narrowed in a grim satisfaction. "Well, well, well," he drawled, his pistol leveling at Cale. "Look what the cat dragged in." Or should I say what the little seamstress hid away? Amos Brody spat a wad of tobacco juice onto her floor. "That's him. That's the red-skinned devil that ambushed us." Kyle moved to stand in front of Elara, shielding her with his body. He held his small, skinning knife, a pitiful defense against a loaded gun. "Stand down," Apache Croft snarled. "It's over." "He was hurt," Elara cried out, finding her voice. "I was helping him. It's what any decent person would do." Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Decent harboring a murdering savage? You're a traitor, Elara, and we all know how we deal with traitors." His eyes gleamed with a possessive, cruel light. "But don't you worry. I'll see to your punishment personally." In that split second of distraction as Croft's attention was on her, Kyle acted. He wasn't a warrior for nothing. He kicked the small wooden stool at his feet, sending it sliding across the floor to slam into Croft's legs. The sheriff stumbled his shot, going wild, splintering the window frame. Now Kyle yelled, grabbing Elara's arm. He shoved her toward the window and the dangling rope of silk and satin. "Go, I am right behind you." She didn't hesitate. She scrambled out the window, her hands gripping the surprisingly strong, makeshift rope. Her dress tore on a nail, and she felt a sharp pain as her palms scraped against the rough fabric. But she didn't stop. She slid the last few feet, landing hard in the muck of the alley. Above her she heard a grunt of pain and the crash of furniture. Kyle appeared in the window, a dark gash on his forehead. He began his descent, just as the Brody brothers crowded the window, their faces contorted with rage. "Don't shoot him, you fool!" Croft's voice barked from inside. "I want him alive." Amos Brody, never one for listening, raised his rifle, but Cale was too fast. He let go of the rope, dropping the last 6 feet and rolling as he hit the ground, coming up in a crouch beside her. He grabbed her hand, his grip like steel. "Run!" They sprinted down the alley, their footsteps echoing off the brick walls. A shot rang out, and a bullet whizzed past Elara's ear, so close she felt its heat. They burst out onto a side street, causing a horse to rear in panic. Shouts erupted from the main street. The entire town was now alerted. "This way," Kyle grunted, pulling her toward the edge of town, toward the vast, unforgiving desert that stretched out before them. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, his movements driven by instinct. They scrambled over a low stone wall at the edge of town and plunged into the dense thicket of mesquite and creosote that marked the beginning of the wilderness. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of a posse forming, men shouting dogs, barking horses being saddled. They ran until Elara's lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. Kyle, despite his half-healed wound, seemed tireless, his pace steady and relentless. He pulled her along his strength, lending her own. They were fugitives now fleeing from the only world she had ever known into a world she couldn't possibly imagine. The sun beat down, and the heat rising from the desert floor was suffocating. The sounds of the posse grew fainter, but she knew they wouldn't give up. Not with Sheriff Croft leading them. He wasn't just chasing an escaped Apache anymore. He was chasing her. The desert was a crucible. It burned away everything that was not essential, leaving only the raw, desperate will to survive. For Elara, the first day of their flight was a waking nightmare. The civilized world she knew of soft fabrics, cool water from a well, and shelter from the sun was gone, replaced by a brutal landscape of rock, sand, and thorns. Kyle was no longer the quiet, recuperating patient. He was a force of nature, a creature of this harsh environment. He moved through it not with brute force, but with a deep instinctual understanding. He led them on a weaving, unpredictable path through arroyos and canyons, always keeping to the hard, rocky ground where their tracks would be difficult to follow. He read the land like a book Elara couldn't even begin to comprehend. He pointed out a line of distant cottonwoods that signaled water, a patch of seemingly barren ground that concealed edible roots, the subtle signs that a rattlesnake was sunning itself on a nearby rock. Her fine leather shoes were shredded within hours, her dress torn to rags by grasping thorns. The sun beat down relentlessly, and her throat was a dry, rasping agony. By midday, she collapsed, her body giving out. "I can't," she gasped, slumping to the ground. "I can't go on." Kyle stopped, his face grim. He knelt beside her, pulling a small water skin from his belt. A belt, she now saw, was expertly crafted, with hidden pockets and loops. He gave her a small sip, rationing the precious liquid. "The posse is 2, maybe 3 hours behind," he said, his voice flat and practical. "They have horses. We have only our feet. If we stop, they will find us." "Then let them," she whispered, tears of exhaustion blurring her vision. "I don't care anymore." Kyle's expression hardened. He grabbed her chin, his grip firm but not cruel, forcing her to look at him. "You saved my life in your town. Do not make me leave you to die in my world." His words were like a splash of cold water. She saw in his eyes not pity, but a demand. He was challenging her to find the same strength she had shown in her little room. Shamed and resolute, she nodded. He helped her to her feet. That evening he showed her how to find water by digging in the sand of a dry wash. It was gritty and tasted of minerals, but it was the most precious thing she had ever drunk. He fashioned a pair of crude sandals for her from a piece of his own buckskin leggings and the tattered remains of her petticoat. As he worked by the light of a tiny smokeless fire, she tended to his wound, which had begun to weep from the exertion. The gash on his forehead was already healing, but the bullet wound in his side was a constant throbbing threat. They spoke little during the day, conserving their energy. But at night, huddled together for warmth against the surprising desert cold, they talked. He taught her the names of the stars in his language, vast constellations that told the stories of his people. She told him about the books she had read, tales of faraway places with green fields and endless rain. Their bond, forged in the crucible of shared danger, deepened into something more profound. There was a raw intimacy in their survival. She watched him set a snare for a rabbit with breathtaking skill, and he watched her use a needle and thread from her salvaged sewing kit to stitch a tear in his water skin with a precision he admired. They were from two different worlds, but here, stripped of everything, they were simply a man and a woman who depended on each other for their very lives. On the fourth day, they reached the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains. The landscape changed the flat desert floor, giving way to soaring peaks of red rock and canyons shaded by pine and oak. The air grew cooler, and the scent of pine was a balm to Elara's frayed nerves. But their pursuers were relentless. From a high ridge, Kyle spotted them, a dust cloud in the distance, small figures on horseback, moving with grim purpose. Croft Kyle said, his voice a low growl. He does not give up. He looked at Elara, his eyes filled with a new urgency. We must climb. The horses cannot follow where we are going. The climb was treacherous, a grueling ascent over scree slopes and along narrow ledges with dizzying drops. Elara, who had once been afraid of the height of her own second-story window, found a reserve of courage she never knew she had. She focused only on Cale's feet in front of her, placing her own feet in the same spots, trusting him implicitly. Finally, as dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and orange, they arrived. Kyle led her through a narrow passage between two towering monoliths of rock that opened into a hidden valley. Elara gasped. It was a paradise hidden in the heart of the stone. A clear, cold stream tumbled over rocks, feeding a lush meadow, dotted with wildflowers. On the valley floor, nestled amongst ancient oak trees, was a village of wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings made of branches and hides. Smoke curled lazily from several of them, and the sounds of children laughing and dogs barking filled the air. This was the stronghold. This was Kyle's home. As they walked into the center of the village, a silence fell. People emerged from their homes, their faces a mixture of shock, joy, and deep suspicion. They stared at Kyle, their returning warrior, and then their dark, questioning eyes fell upon Elara. They looked at her tattered dress, her sunburnt face, her pale skin. She was the enemy, the Pindalikoyi, walking into the very heart of their sanctuary. A tall, imposing man with a face like a weathered cliff and eyes that held the same fierce intelligence as Cale's stepped forward. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, but he carried himself with an authority that was undeniable. "My son," he said, his voice deep and resonant. He embraced Kyle, a brief, powerful gesture. Then his gaze, hard and unforgiving, settled on Elara. "You bring a stranger into our home, a white eye. Explain this." Kyle stood tall, placing a protective hand on Elara's shoulder. "Father," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "This is Elara Vance. She saved my life, and she is with me." The declaration hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. Elara stood beside him, trembling but resolute, facing the collective gaze of the Chiricahua Apache. She had survived, the desert escaped the posse, and journeyed into a world beyond her wildest dreams. But she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that her greatest trial had only just begun. The suspicion in the Apache camp was a palpable thing, as thick and clinging as the morning fog in the canyons. Elara was an omen, a disruption to the ancient rhythms of their lives. The women stared at her with open hostility, their whispers following her like stinging insects. The children, a mixture of fear and curiosity, would peek at her from behind their mother's skirts before darting away. She was given a small empty wickiup near the edge of the village, a gesture that was both provision and isolation. Kyle brought her food venison stew and flatbreads, but he was quickly summoned by his father, Taza, the chief of their band. Elara sat alone inside the small dwelling, the scent of pine and wood smoke, strange and overwhelming. She could hear the murmur of voices from the center of the camp where a council fire had been lit. She knew they were discussing her fate. She was a liability, a weakness. Her presence told the world outside that the impenetrable stronghold could be breached. Worse, she was living proof that one of their fiercest warriors had been weak enough to be shot and left for dead. Later that night, Kyle returned. His face was etched with exhaustion and frustration. "The council is divided," he told her, his voice low. "My father listens, but others, they see only the color of your skin. They see the soldiers who burn our villages and the prospectors who poison our water." One man in particular spoke against her, a warrior named Nakai. He was broad-shouldered and powerful, his face marked with a long scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. "Nakai has always been my rival," Kyle explained. "He sees this as a chance to question my honor, to challenge my place as my father's son. He says I have been bewitched by a white woman, that my mind has been softened by her medicine." "What will happen?" Elara asked, her voice a fearful whisper. "My father is wise. He will not act in haste. But you must prove you are not a threat. You must show them you have a strong heart." How could she prove her heart to a people whose language she did not speak, whose customs she did not understand? She was a seamstress. Her skills were in the delicate, the quiet, the domestic. Here worth was measured in the ability to hunt, to fight, to endure. For days, Elara remained in her self-imposed exile, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her. She watched the women as they worked their hands, skilled and efficient, at scraping hides, grinding corn and weaving baskets. Her own hand, soft and nimble with a needle, felt useless. Then she noticed something. The children, while wary of her, were also fascinated by the remnants of her dress, by the small, shining needle she kept pinned to her collar. One little girl, bolder than the rest, crept near her wickiup, clutching a small doll made of buckskin and stuffed with grass. The doll's leg was torn. She held it out to Elara, her dark eyes wide and pleading. Elara smiled gently, a gesture she hoped was universal. She took the doll, and using a strand of her own auburn hair as thread, she began to sew. Her stitches were tiny, perfect, and almost invisible. She didn't just mend the tear. She embroidered a small, delicate flower over the spot. When she handed it back, the little girl gasped in delight. It was a start. The next day, a woman approached her hesitantly, holding a leather pouch with a broken strap. Elara repaired it. Then another came with a tear in a child's winter cloak. Soon a small, steady stream of women came to her wickiup, not with friendship, but with a practical need she could fulfill. They did not speak to her, but a silent, grudging respect began to form. They saw the strength and artistry in her hands. They called her the sewing woman. But this small acceptance did nothing to sway Nakai. He saw her growing influence as a threat. One evening, as the council met again, he strode into the center of the village and issued a formal challenge. "Our warrior Kale claims this white woman has a strong heart," Nakai's voice boomed across the firelit clearing. but he himself has been weakened. He was bested by 2 white prospectors and saved by a woman. His honor is stained. I challenge his right to speak for her. I challenge him. It was not a challenge to a duel, but a test of skill and endurance. A hunt. They would both leave at dawn, carrying only a knife and a bow. The first to return with a mature male mountain lion would be declared the victor, his word, carrying the weight of honor in the council. It was a dangerous, almost impossible task. Mountain lions were ghosts of the high peaks, cunning and deadly. Taza, his face, impassive, agreed. The law of the challenge could not be denied. Kyle's face was grim as he prepared his weapons. His wound was not fully healed, and a grueling mountain hunt would push his body to its limits. "This is my fight," he told Elara, his jaw tight. "I must do this." "It is a fight over me," she replied, her heart aching. "Your life is at risk because of me." "My life is my own because of you," he said fiercely, his hand covering hers. "Do not forget that. I am not fighting for you, Elara. I am fighting for us." As the 2 warriors disappeared into the pre-dawn light, a new tension settled over the camp. The posse, led by Sheriff Croft and the Brody brothers, had not been seen for days. The Apache believed they had given up, turned back, by the impassable mountains. They were wrong. Jebediah and Amos Brody were not men to give up on vengeance or gold. Guided by a disgruntled ex-cavalry scout named Peters, they had found a little-known treacherous passage that led into the high country. Croft, driven by his obsessive need to reclaim Elara and punish her, pushed them onward. They weren't looking for the main stronghold. Peters knew of a smaller, higher camp, used by the Apache for hunting and gathering, a place that would be less guarded. A place where they might find silver deposits rumored to be in the area. They were unwittingly climbing the same mountain where Kyle and Nakai were now hunting their paths, converging toward a violent, inevitable collision. Elara, unaware of the approaching danger, could only watch the mountains and pray. She had managed to sew a fragile peace for herself with a needle and thread, but she knew that the fate of her future and Kale's was being decided high above, in the silent, deadly world of the mountain lion. The silence of the high peaks was Kyle's domain. For 2 days, he moved like a spirit through the rock and pine, his senses honed to a razor's edge. He wasn't just hunting a mountain lion. He was hunting the whispers of doubt that had followed him from Redemption Gulch. On the 3rd morning, he cornered the great cat in a box canyon. The ensuing battle was a maelstrom of muscle claw and steel. Kyle emerged victorious, bleeding, and exhausted the lion still at his feet. His honor was satisfied. But as he crossed a lower trail to begin his descent, he saw something that erased all thoughts of his prize, the tracks of shod horses. They were fresh, and heading not for the main stronghold, but toward the smaller, less defended hunting camp where his aunt and several other families were staying. Instantly he knew. It was Croft. Vengeance and honor were meaningless luxuries. Abandoning the lion, Kale began to run. His only thought was to get to his people before the wolf arrived at the fold. Lower on the same mountain, Sheriff Croft, the Brody brothers and their scout Peters finalized their brutal plan. "It's a small camp," Peters confirmed, pointing to a distant ridge. "Women, old men. The warriors are hunting. We'll hit them at first light." Amos Brody's eyes glinted with greed for the silver rumored to be nearby, but Croft's gaze was fixed on the unseen camp with a possessive fire. "The girl will be there," he snarled, "and this time she won't escape." Back in the stronghold, the distant, sharp crackle of rifle fire sent a wave of panic through the village. Taza Kyle's father began barking orders, assembling his warriors for a desperate ride. But Elara knew they would be too late. The main trail was too long. Frantically, she ran to the chief, pointing toward a treacherous-looking notch in the distant mountains. "Taza the pass," she cried. "The one I saw yesterday. It must be a shortcut." The chief's eyes followed her finger. It was a dangerous goat trail, but her outsider's eye had seen what his people's familiarity had overlooked: a direct path. He made a swift, decisive choice. "Follow her," he commanded a small group of his fastest warriors. "She will guide you." Mounted on a swift pony, Elara led the warriors into the mountains, her terror eclipsed by a fierce, burning resolve. They arrived on the ridge overlooking the hunting camp to a scene of horror. Croft and his men were victorious, their rifles smoking. They were rounding up the terrified women and children. Elara watched in horror as Croft dragged a woman from a wickiup, his face a mask of cruel triumph. With a unified, chilling war cry, Taza's warriors plunged down the mountainside, catching the attackers in a complete surprise. At that exact moment, a lone, blood-streaked figure burst from the trees on the opposite side of the camp, a knife in his hand and fury in his eyes. It was Kyle. The battle was short and savage. While the warriors cut down the posse, Kyle headed straight for Croft. The two men crashed together in a brutal personal war. Croft was larger, but Kyle was driven by a righteous fury for his home and the woman who had saved him. As they grappled in the dust, Elara saw Amos Brody level his rifle at Kyle's exposed back. Without a second thought, she spurred her pony forward, screaming Coil's name. Her desperate charge was just enough to startle Brody's horse, throwing his aim wide as Kyle drove his knife home into Croft's chest. The rifle fired and a searing pain tore through Elara's arm as the bullet meant for Kyle grazed her flesh. When the dust settled, the invaders were dead. The camp was saved. Kyle rushed to Elara's side, his face a mask of fear and relief. He tore a strip from his shirt and gently bandaged her bleeding arm. "You are hurt," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You are alive," she whispered, back her hand reaching up to touch his face. Taza walked through the quiet devastation, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He saw the bodies of their enemies, the tears of his people, and his son tending to the white woman who was bleeding for them. His eyes, full of a chief's wisdom, saw the truth. He turned to face the survivors and his warriors, his voice ringing with authority. "For many seasons the White Eyes have brought us only sorrow. Today, a white woman led our warriors on a secret path to save us. She shed her blood for our people. Her heart is Chiricahua." He let the words settle a new law for a new time. He then looked directly at his son. "Kyle, you fight not for prizes but for your people. You have brought this woman to us. What is your wish?" Kyle stood, pulling Elara gently to her feet. He held her hand tightly, facing his father and all his people. His voice, clear and full of a love that bridged two worlds, echoed through the canyon. "My wish," Kyle declared, his eyes locked on Elara's, "is to take Elara Vance as my wife. Here. Now. Before you all." And so, as the sun set on the blood-soaked earth, a simple ceremony bound them together. Before the tribe that was now her own, Elara Vance, the Orphan Seamstress, was married to Kale, the Apache warrior. She was no longer an outsider, no longer a stranger. Her life, once defined by the fine, invisible stitches she sewed alone in a dusty room, was now woven into the strong, vibrant fabric of the Chiricahua people, a thread of courage and love for all to see. And so, the story of Elara and Kale was woven into the history of the Chiricahua Mountains. It serves as a powerful reminder that even in the most brutal of times, courage is not defined by the strength of your sword arm, but by the compassion in your heart. Theirs was a love born in secrets, and sealed in battle, a testament to the fact that home is not always the place you are born, but the place you are willing to fight for. It teaches us that true family is not about the color of your skin, but about the spirit you share. If their incredible journey from two separate worlds to one shared life moved you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you appreciate these deep dives into the forgotten corners of the Old West. Share this video with someone who loves a story of survival courage and forbidden love. And most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another tale from the untamed frontier. Thank you for listening.